Good morning. So this is the 27th of April, 2023. 3 decades after the first elections took place on the 27th of April, 1994. And sadly today, South Africans throughout the country are asking themselves, why should we celebrate this Freedom Day? When we do not have jobs, when we are living in dire poverty, when we have the highest murder rate in the world, when gender-based violence is rife, and up to 8 hours a day, we are sitting in darkness. Yes, truly, the ideals, the hopes, those great ideals that the people of South Africa went to the polling booths on the 27th of April 1994 have not been met. It has been met by disappointment and disillusionment. I remember so well how I participated in those first elections in 1994. I voted in Alexandra, the township where I did most of my political mobilization and work, both as a member of the African National Congress and as a commander of Umkhonto we Sizwe. It is there where I did the underground work in the cells of Umkhonto we Sizwe. I wanted to bring my vote out there amongst the people of Alex with whom I worked, whose ideals and pain and suffering I shared. When I arrived at the Dutch Reformed Church in Africa in 12th Avenue, which was one of the designated polling stations, the security who were with me said, let's take you to the front of the row because you've got a lot of work to do. At that stage, I was the national spokesperson of the African National Congress. And I said, no. I want to stand in this long queue that is snaking all the way downtown, down 12th Avenue, where thousands of people are waiting for the first time in their lives to bring out their vote. I want to watch the excitement of every one of those fellow South Africans going into that polling booth, making their cross. I watched young people, old people, very old people in their 80s and 90s, walking with walking sticks, coming in wheelchairs to vote for the first time. I saw an old woman in her 80s coming out of the polling booth, dancing, singing, giving expression to her excitement. Yes, we had high hopes. We believed that South Africa was now going to be totally free. And we believed that whatever is still wrong will be corrected by the African National Congress, which had been voted into government with so much overwhelming trust by the vast majority of Black and especially South African voters. And of course, there were hopes that as time goes on, in the subsequent elections, whatever compromises were made during the CODESA negotiations would eventually be corrected. That the issues around the return of the land to the people, Section 25 in the Constitution, that provides guarantees to property rights, which were truly wrong, because it gave guarantees to the colonists who stole the land from the indigenous people, would be corrected. And that's why time after time, when election day came, 5 years every time along, people voted overwhelmingly for the African National Congress. During the administration of President Thabo Mbeki, he managed to garner a 2/3 majority. And there were high hopes that now finally we can change the constitution in the way that will truly serve the hopes and the interests of our people. But sadly, that was not done. That trust by the people, that overwhelming vote of over 2/3, which was given to the Thabo Mbeki administration, was squandered. Instead, we were given gear, new liberal economic policies that continued to be extended and cemented in the economic policy program of the African National Congress. Sadly, it became evident that yes, the African National Congress was in office, but it was not in power. The power continued to be with the white monopoly capitalists and the imperialists. And actually, as time went on, with only that period when President Jacob Zuma was president, hope again being rekindled that we could take control of a true radical economic transformation economic program. But beyond that, as time went on, the people of South Africa saw their hopes for economic empowerment more and more slipping away. We were plunging deeper and deeper into the depths of being a servant state for the big imperialist economic powers. Our mineral wealth was being extracted, but it was exported without beneficiation. Our economic model continued to be one of subjugation to the imperialist West, and inside the country, to subjugation to white monopoly capitalists. A small group of white monopoly capitalist elite who, together with a small group of comprador black African capitalists, had taken control of this economy and were simply serving their own interests. No care for the majority of poor black and African people. No proper care in terms of service delivery. In fact, as the years went on, service delivery became poorer and poorer. The hope that those values that are set out in the Freedom Charter for people being in control of the land, for people being able to have proper health care, free, equal, and quality education, health care, housing, all of it was disappearing. The reality was that poverty became the norm cemented in, and that a small group of elites, mainly driven by white monopoly capitalism, but including also a black capitalist elite, had taken control and cared no more for the majority of South Africans. And of course, finally, when Cyril Ramaphosa became the president of the African National Congress, by bribing his way into the presidency at the 54th National Conference of the ANC in 2017, and repeating that exercise 5 years later at the 55th National Conference of the ANC last year in December, again at Nazareth, hope was gone. The people of South Africa now had to realize that the hope that they had placed in the liberation movement that the African National Congress was misplaced. That liberation movement had been so badly infiltrated over so many years by agents of white monopoly capitalism and imperialism, that there was no hope that this ANC, which was no longer the ANC representing the ideals of our full liberation, the ideals of the return of the land to the people, the ideals of control over the economy by the people of this country, that this ANC was now a hollowed out Trojan horse, there to simply service the monopoly capitalists and implementing new liberal economic policy programs. I'm telling this long historical analysis because it is important to understand how many of us, including myself, over years had hoped that the true liberation of our country will be achieved and that the African National Congress could be the vehicle to achieve that full liberation objective. There are those of us who worked within the ANC over many years. I personally joined the ANC when I was 19 years old in 1979. I was a member of the African National Congress for 43 years. And during that time, I continued to speak out, like so many other comrades did, against imperialism, against neoliberal economic policies. I was outraged when in 1991, President Nelson Mandela went to Davos and said that nationalization is no longer the economic policy program of the ANC. I was fundamentally opposed to President Thabo Mbeki introducing GEAR and the neoliberal economic program that kept on being rolling out. I was hopeful when President Jacob Zuma became the president of the ANC in Polokwane. I was disappointed by how the white monopoly capitalists and imperialists managed to put so much pressure on President Zuma that it was not possible to implement a full and comprehensive program for radical economic transformation. I acknowledge what he achieved, but I also acknowledge how he was prevented from implementing a true and full program of radical economic transformation. And during the time that Cyril Ramaphosa came into power, I spoke out together with other comrades who are true progressives and who were inside the African National Congress. Why do I say this? Because I see those who are writing on social media and other media platforms now that have got nothing to say about this situation that we are faced with. I've been for so many years a member of the ANC. How can I now criticize the disaster that has resulted? I was correct to try my level best to fight the selling out within the African National Congress of the agents that infiltrated the ANC, of an ANC elite who didn't care for the majority of Black and especially African people, as far and as much as I could within the ANC. I did so. I can with pride say that the message that I delivered right from the beginning when I was the national spokesperson of the African National Congress, the ideals with which I joined the ANC in June 1979 in Botswana, the ideals for which I went to prison for almost 10 years, for which I was tortured, for which I lost most of my hearing, the long months of solitary confinement and torture at the hands of the security police at John Foster Square. Those ideals I stood for throughout. I spoke out against the neoliberal economic policy program that Thabo Mbeki introduced. I pushed as hard as I could when Jacob Zuma was the president and under his administration to see radical economic transformation being implemented. I opposed the election of Cyril Ramaphosa as president of the African National Congress. I was one of the leaders in the campaign of Comrade Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma to make sure that Ramaphosa would not be elected, because I knew from my experience with Ramaphosa when I worked with him, when he was the Secretary General of the ANC and I was the national spokesperson in the early 1990s, that he was a sellout, that he was an agent of white monopoly capitalism, and that we would destroy our hopes for full economic liberation. I continue to oppose the programs of neoliberalism the selling out to the white monopoly capitalists, the way in which Ramaphosa continued to prioritize relations with the West, with the United Kingdom, and with the United States of America above BRICS. I opposed that. I spoke out as national spokesperson then of Umkhonto we Sizwe Military Veterans Association. The statements that I've issued, realms of statements, day after day, stand there as the historical history of the fight that I picked up. I spoke out many years even before then, during the early 1990s when the CODESA negotiations were going on. I stood on platforms together with Comrade Chris Hani. I stood in Boksburg 5 days before Comrade Chris was assassinated. And I spoke out against the compromises of CODESA, about the property clauses that should not have been there, cementing the illegal land grab of the colonists and turning it into land rights. I spoke out together with Comrade Chris against the sunset clauses. I bewailed the fact that our negotiating team were led by sellouts, were more interested in enriching themselves and making deals with the apartheid regime negotiators than putting a real and proper and liberated constitution in place for our people. And I spoke out when Cyril Ramaphosa and his acolytes in the National Executive Committee of the ANC refused to implement the radical economic transformation resolutions of the 55th and 54th National Conferences of the ANC. I spoke out. I went and stood alone outside the meetings of the National Executive Committee of the ANC, protesting that Ramaphosa must go. I went to the various provincial conferences that took place in the period of 2021 and 2022. I stood outside those conferences, sometimes alone, sometimes with a number of other comrades, carrying my placard saying, Ramaphosa must go. So I have no reason to be apologetic for the positions that I've taken in the past, and I acknowledge the other comrades who with me took similar positions. And I'm therefore no reason to be apologetic about the decision that I took after the 55th National Conference, when Ramaphosa once again bought his way into the presidency of the African National Congress by bribing through millions and millions of rands. When I then said, now that I see that the radical economic policy program that was adopted at the 54th National Conference was being trashed by the sham 55th Conference. Now that I see that there is again election manipulation, that there's again the buying of votes, and that Ramaphosa and his friends have bought their way even with more money into the National Executive Committee of the ANC. Now that I see that the space for me to do my best to work inside the African National Congress, to bring an end to this selling out project, to try and fight for the true liberation of our people, to try and make true what Comrade Oliver Reginald Tambo spoke about when he said that liberation cannot just be liberation from racism, but it must always also be liberation from capitalist, white monopoly capital exploitation and oppression. When I saw that the space is gone, I had the courage to stand up and say, now I'm resigning from this thing that still calls itself the ANC, because I'm clear that this thing is no longer the ANC that I joined in 1979, that it no longer stands for the ideals why I joined the liberation movement, and therefore I can no longer be part of it. Before the 55th National Conference, I stated clearly that if Cyril Ramaphosa returned at that conference and there was a continuation of the sellout political and economic program that the ANC under him in the previous 5 years had followed, I will leave. And I did. I acted with integrity. My actions before in the ANC in opposing selling out, opposing neoliberalism, working for full liberation, and my decision to eventually resign was a golden thread. There was no inconsistency. It remained the same. I do not just want to talk about myself. I want to talk about why many of us who had been members of the African National Congress when it was still a liberation movement had finally reached the point where we had to say, thus far and no further. And that is why in February of this year, in 2023, on the 23rd of February, we formed the African Radical Economic Transformation Alliance, a political organization which started as an NPC, but which is now in the process of registering as a full political party and will participate in the upcoming elections as a national political party in both the national and provincial elections. We formed it because we are returning to the true ideals for full liberation. And it is in that context, with ARETA working for the implementation also of the fundamental radical economic transformation of our economy, of the expropriation of land without compensation, the nationalization of the South African Reserve Bank, opposing the privatization of our state-owned enterprises, and promising that those state-owned enterprises that have been privatized, from Denel to SAA to Armscor to ISCO, will be returned as state-owned enterprises. That we will create a state bank, that we will oppose the destruction of Eskom as one of our most essential state-owned enterprises, that we will not allow ourselves to become the extension of the deliberate energy insecurity that is being created by the West in South Africa by relying on so-called renewables and private power producers. But that the state must provide electricity, and that we must use the most important resource that we have, which is coal, high-grade coal that we have in South Africa, and generate the electricity that will mean that we will not have load shedding, and that we will be able to have electricity to also beneficiate our minerals, and through that beneficiation process, create new jobs, restructure our financial institutions so that available capital is there, and also affordable capital for young Black and especially African entrepreneurs, medium and small class businesses to grow, to create jobs, and to become part of this economy. To make sure that the white monopoly capitalists will not be the majority shareholders on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. That the promise that we made so many years ago to our young people during the first elections on the 27th of April 1994, when we put up those posters that said free, quality education for all, will become a true reality. That we will call for national service for young people so that they can go and serve our country, but at the same time also get the necessary training so that they become employable and are able to make a contribution to this nation. Not sit around unemployed, desperate, without horizons of hope, becoming the victims of drugs and of crime. These are the commitments that the African Radical Economic Transformation Alliance stands for. And these are the commitments with which we stand today on this 27th of April 2023, this so-called Freedom Day. And we say, we compare what the Cyril Ramaphosa dictatorship, that regime of sellouts, is doing, the way in which they are destroying our economy, the 36.8% unemployment rate, the high levels of crime, blackouts all around, an inconsistent international diplomatic policy. One day you say you're going to withdraw from the ICC. The next day you crabble back. The next day you say, no, you misunderstood me and the Secretary General of the ANC, Fikile Mbalula. We didn't mean what we said, because we received a phone call from London and phone calls from Washington telling us that we cannot and we will not be allowed to withdraw from the ICC. We've got no consistency in our international diplomatic policy. We do not have the pride of an independent sovereign state. We become a servant state of big imperialism. So with all of that we face right now, we have to say, our nation has nothing to celebrate on this 27th of April 2023. 29 years after the first elections on the 27th of April 1994. We have been betrayed by sellout leaders in a sham ANC, which is no longer the African National Congress of the true liberation struggle that our people dedicated their lives to, that so many young people suffered and died for, that so many great leaders made the ultimate sacrifice for. So we have to say, today we cannot celebrate Liberation Day. We cannot say it is Freedom Day, because it is not. Our people are not free from unemployment. They're not free from want. They're not free from economic domination by a small white monopoly capitalist group in conjunction with a black comprador sellout class. They're not free from imperialism. Our nation doesn't have the freedom to determine its own international economic and diplomatic policy program. We are under subjugation. And a nation which is under subjugation is a slave nation. So like that freedom song that comes also out of the era of the slaves in the United States of America sing, and which I listened to last night when Harry Belafonte was commemorated by us in our Twitter space. The song with that haunting refrain, freedom, oh freedom. Let us all stand for it. Let us all dedicate ourselves. That freedom song of the slaves is on our lips today, because sadly, although it is 29 years after the first so-called democratic elections on the 27th of April 1994, we are still slaves in our own nation. We are still being subjugated. We are still being exploited. We do not determine our own future. Our children, in fact, do not have a future under this sellout, sham ANC regime. And thus, while we say we cannot celebrate freedom today, and there is no reason to call this day now Freedom Day, we can say that we do have a program of hope, that it can change. We do have a program of hope as the African Radical Economic Transformation Alliance, which is clearly extrapolated on in our 10-point plan. The main headlines of that plan, which I've just explained, starting with the foundation of the return of the land to the people, expropriation without compensation, a control over our economy, a beneficiation of our wealth by our own labor and by our own financial institutions, including also a state bank, and through state-owned enterprises that are not being destroyed, but are being built up and are there to serve the people, provide employment, provide electricity, provide a better life to all. So, in sadness, we acknowledge this Freedom Day we cannot celebrate. But with excitement and determination, we state that we are committed to change all of that we will work together with all progressive forces of the left, other political parties, the ATM, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the United Democratic Movement, the Economic Freedom Fighters, other civil society organizations committed to true and full liberation and freedom. And we will not stop. We will not tire to do so. Our commitment is clear. We must make sure that the sellouts go. This sellout, sham African National Congress, must go. And next year, when the national and provincial elections take place, every South African must register. Every South African must bring out their vote. No one must abstain because they feel despondent, because they feel that they've been betrayed by the ANC. The true action that will free us and liberate us from the sham ANC that now makes us suffer in the way we do is to register to vote right, to vote the ANC out. Yes, vote ARETA. Vote for progressive political parties. Vote for a progressive program of radical economic transformation. Stand together, forge unity of the progressive left, and take control of our own destiny. So that is the message that I wanted to deliver as the president of ARETA this morning, on this day that we cannot celebrate as Freedom Day. But it is not a message of despondency. It is not a message of defeat. It is a message of struggle. It is a message of fighting. It is a message that is summarized by the phrase, by the slogan that we've made our own. A luta continua. The struggle will continue until we succeed.